In the dying winter of 1945, while the world's attention was fixed on the crumbling Reich, a small group of men slipped silently into the Austrian Alps under the cover of darkness. Their mission was so secret that even many within the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, knew nothing about it. It was called Operation Greenup, a covert intelligence gathering mission that would bring three men face to face with the cold heart of Nazi Germany. The team parachuted from AB-24 Liberator late on the night of February 26, 1945. Below them lay the snow-drenched peaks of the Tyrolean Alps, an unforgiving wilderness of rock and ice that served as both shield and prison. The team consisted of Friedrich Mayer, an Austrian-born American Jew fluent in German, Hans Wijnberg, a Dutch Jewish refugee trained as a radio operator, and Franz Weber, a former Wehrmacht officer who had defected after losing faith in Hitler's regime. Together, they carried only what could fit into their parachute packs: radio gear, forged identification papers, ration packs, and a small arsenal of Colt pistols and grenades. Their objective was clear: infiltrate the city of Innsbruck, the key link between Italy and Germany, and gather intelligence on German troop movements through the Brenner Pass, one of the last remaining supply arteries of the Reich. The Allied command in Italy, under General Mark Clark, desperately needed this information to plan the final assault northward. Yet, what the three men faced on the ground was far from what their superiors imagined. The landing was rough. Strong winds scattered the team across a frozen slope near the village of Oberperfuss. Wijnberg's radio case cracked on impact, forcing the men to spend 2 days repairing it with improvised soldering tools fashioned from a mess tin. By the time they regrouped, the snow was waist-deep, and their rations already running low. "The mountain was our first enemy," Mayer later recalled in a post-war interview. "The cold didn't care what flag you fought under." They sought refuge in an abandoned shepherd's hut, covering their parachutes under rocks and ice. For days, they huddled in silence as German patrols combed the area. It was Weber's local knowledge, his understanding of Tyrolean dialects and old army habits, that saved them. Through his contacts, he arranged safe passage to a nearby resistance group. The Austrian underground, though small, provided what little help they could: forged papers, food, and a tenuous promise of silence. But even among allies, trust was a fragile thing. The human struggle of Operation Greenup wasn't just against nature, it was against fear itself. Mayer, being Jewish, knew capture would mean immediate execution. Wijnberg, with his radio, carried the only lifeline to OSS headquarters in Bari, Italy, a fragile connection through mountain interference and enemy jamming. Every transmission risked detection by German signal intelligence. And Weber, the defector, lived with the constant suspicion that both sides might brand him a traitor. In his post-war debriefing, Mayer described one night when they almost gave up. "We heard dogs, maybe half a kilometer away," he said. "We thought it was the end. I told Hans to burn the papers. He refused, said if we burned them, we'd lose the reason we were here." That single decision kept the mission alive, though at great risk. By early March, the men had established a temporary base in a farmhouse overlooking the Inn Valley. From there, they began observing German rail convoys, troop trains, fuel transports, and ammunition cars, all streaming north through the Brenner Pass. Using a compact Type 3 Mark II transmitter, Wijnberg sent encoded Morse messages to OSS command detailing schedules and unit movements. Each successful transmission meant risking triangulation by German direction finders. Yet, the data they sent would later prove critical for Allied bombing operations in northern Italy. The beauty of the mountains contrasted sharply with the darkness of their work. Villagers went about their lives under the constant hum of Luftwaffe patrols, unaware that 3 strangers in their midst were altering the course of the war. Mayer often watched from the upper window of their hideout, seeing the German columns wind like a metal serpent through the valleys. He later wrote, "They looked invincible, but their faces were hollow. They were ghosts marching toward the end." Still, uncertainty gnawed at them. One night, Weber failed to return from a meeting with a supposed resistance contact in the nearby town of Telfs. The team waited for 2 days, scanning the mountains for movement, but there was nothing. Had he been caught? Betrayed? Or worse, was the defection a ruse all along? The silence weighed heavily, and though Weber returned the next morning claiming he had been delayed by patrols, the doubt never truly left them. As March drew on, the OSS team knew they had to move deeper toward Innsbruck. Their mission was just beginning, and their presence in the mountains was becoming untenable. Supplies were dwindling, snow melt threatened their radio position, and the locals were growing uneasy about strangers in their midst. Still, they pressed on, driven by duty, desperation, and the quiet knowledge that the war's end might not come soon enough for them. In the shadow of the Alps, the first phase of Operation Greenup had succeeded, but at a cost no one yet understood. The next step would take them into the heart of Nazi control, where deception would be their only shield and trust their most dangerous weapon. By mid-March 1945, Friedrich Mayer and his surviving team descended from the frozen heights into the valleys of Tyrol. Ahead lay Innsbruck, a city still firmly under Nazi control, bristling with Gestapo offices, anti-aircraft guns, and military police. It was a place where a single unfamiliar face could trigger suspicion and arrest. Yet, in that nest of vigilance, the OSS planned to hide in plain sight. Mayer's greatest weapon wasn't his pistol or his forged papers, it was his fluency. Born in Freiburg, Germany, and raised in the pre-war years before fleeing Nazi persecution, he spoke the language of the Reich like a native. Now, as an American sergeant behind enemy lines, he would use that voice to deceive the enemy that once called him its own. Disguised as a wounded German officer returning from the Eastern Front, he moved through Innsbruck with calm precision, carrying identification papers signed by Major Franz Weber, the same defector who now risked exposure by aiding him. The transformation was complete. Mayer's hair was slicked back, his uniform authentic down to the Iron Cross ribbon. Even his limp, rehearsed to perfection, added credibility. "We walked among them, and they didn't know," Mayer would later recall. "Every salute, every checkpoint, every conversation could have been our last." The pain of the mission was both physical and psychological. Innsbruck was a city under strain, bombed, rationed, and fearful. German soldiers patrolled the streets, while refugees from the east crowded the railway stations. Mayer had to live among them, eating in public canteens, sleeping in a safe house above a mechanic's garage, and pretending to believe in a war he had every reason to despise. The locals whispered about deserters being shot, about informants disappearing overnight. For a man who had lost friends and family to the Gestapo, it was a bitter irony. He now wore their uniform to bring them down. Meanwhile, Hans Wittenberg operated from the outskirts, sending coded transmissions to OSS headquarters in Bari. His station was set up in an abandoned barn outside the village of Oberperfuss, barely shielded from the icy wind. Each transmission had to be short, never more than 90 seconds, to avoid detection. Using a British Type 3 Mark II transmitter, he sent intelligence on train schedules, fuel depots, and troop strengths, including details of SS units retreating from Italy. His reports reached Allied intelligence planners within hours, guiding bombers and ground forces as they closed in on the Alps. Mayer's infiltration deepened. Using Weber's contacts, he secured a position as an engineer with a local railway authority, an ideal cover to access train manifests and troop rosters. There, among the cluttered offices and ration books, he copied key details onto cigarette paper, hidden inside a hollowed-out pencil. Night after night, he passed the data through couriers to Wittenberg, who transmitted it south. But the risk was growing. In late March, a German counterintelligence sweep began investigating reports of foreign transmissions near Innsbruck. Radio tracking teams moved through the valleys with detection vans. Resistance groups were rounded up. Mayer could feel the tightening noose. Still, he refused to stop. The information was worth the danger, he told OSS command after the war. Every train we reported delayed the Reich's last breath. What made Mayer's courage extraordinary wasn't just his defiance, it was his restraint. He avoided sabotage, knowing that one explosion could expose the entire network. His mission was intelligence, not heroics. And in that quiet discipline lay his genius. "Patience is the best camouflage," he later wrote in his debriefing notes. "They see only what they expect to see." The human toll began to show. Sleep-deprived, hunted, and malnourished, the men lived on edge. Once, During a Gestapo sweep, Mayer was stopped at a checkpoint near the Maria Theresienstrasse. An officer demanded his identification. Mayer handed over his forged papers, suppressing his trembling hands. The officer looked at him for a long moment, then snapped a salute and waved him through. Only later did Mayer learn that the officer had served in the same regiment as the man whose identity he'd stolen. Such moments of near discovery defined Operation Greenup. Every successful deception carried the weight of tragedy and irony, Jewish agents passing undetected among the very men who had hunted their families. In the evenings, Mayer recorded observations in a small notebook. One entry read, "To beat them, I must think like them. But I cannot allow myself to become them." Weber, meanwhile, faced his own struggle. Rumors began spreading among his old acquaintances in Innsbruck that a Wehrmacht deserter was collaborating with foreigners. His contacts in the resistance urged him to flee, but he refused, determined to see the mission through. His knowledge of the terrain and German logistics was irreplaceable. Yet, his visible anxiety began to draw attention, a problem Mayer could not afford. By early April, their reports had grown more frequent. Allied bombers, guided by their intelligence, struck the Brenner Pass with devastating accuracy, cutting vital supply lines between Germany and Italy. But success bred suspicion. The Gestapo could not understand how the Allies knew so much. "There is a spy among us," read a local directive circulated by Innsbruck's Sicherheitsdienst. The hunt had begun. The chapter closes in the smoke and tension of a city on edge. Mayer, standing on a train platform in his officer's uniform, watched a line of refugees board a troop train. Among them was a woman who seemed to recognize him, staring, uncertain. She turned away, but the look stayed with him. Had she truly seen him for who he was, or was it paranoia taking hold? In war, perception itself became the enemy. As the train pulled out, Mayer adjusted his cap and walked into the gathering dusk, unaware that his days of freedom were numbered. By early April 1945, the operation's rhythm had turned from daring to desperate. Mayer's reports from Innsbruck continued to reach OSS headquarters in Bari, but the connection had grown unstable. Wittenberg's transmissions were becoming harder to send. German signal interceptors were sweeping the Tyrol, triangulating every burst of Morse code. The mountain valleys that had once shielded the team were now acting as echo chambers for enemy detection. The weather was thawing, revealing not only the valleys below but also the paths they had used to move unseen. Snowmelt flooded their hideouts, destroying caches of supplies. Every hike between Innsbruck and the outer villages carried a risk of exposure. Worse still, the resistance network that had helped them blend in was fraying. Arrests were spreading through the underground like cracks through ice. For Mayer, the pressure was unbearable. Living under a German identity demanded constant vigilance. One careless word, one wrong salute, could mean exposure. He had managed to secure a routine in the city, a borrowed identity, a forged employment record at the railway office, and a sympathetic landlady who asked few questions. But with each passing day, he felt the walls closing in. The Gestapo had begun questioning civil servants, asking about unfamiliar faces or new hires. Mayer could only pray his papers would withstand scrutiny. Back in Aberperfuss, Wittenberg's radio transmissions were becoming dangerously frequent. He was working from a tiny loft above a hay barn, shielded from the road by stacks of firewood. To send a single message, he needed to assemble the transmitter, tune the frequency, and tap out a stream of dots and dashes that could cross the Alps undetected. But each broadcast increased the risk that German direction finders would locate them. Every few hours, he packed up the set and moved to another barn or abandoned hut, hoping to stay one step ahead of the hunt. Then came the first disappearance. A local courier named Alois, a young Austrian farmer working secretly with the resistance, failed to return from a message drop. He was supposed to deliver a packet of intelligence notes from Mayer to Wittenberg's position. The rendezvous point was a hollow tree above the village of Vals. When Mayer checked it the next night, the packet was gone, but there was no sign of Alois. 2 days later, German police were seen questioning farmers in the area. Mayer knew immediately what that meant. The Gestapo had the courier. The loss of Alois struck the team hard. With him went their most reliable link between city and mountain. Mayer and Wittenberg debated whether to abort the mission. But headquarters in Bari, unaware of the growing danger, kept sending messages, continue observations, confirm troop movements, priority high. To OSS command, the mission was still alive. On the ground, it was beginning to die. From Mayer's own post-war recollection, every time I heard boots in the street, I thought they were coming for me. But I couldn't stop. We had come too far to disappear quietly. By mid-April, rumors of a Gestapo infiltration spread through the local resistance. Someone was leaking names, routes, and safe houses. Weber, the defector who had once been their link to the underground, now found himself accused of betrayal. Mayer confronted him in a dimly lit cellar beneath a farmhouse near Axams. "If you're with them," Mayer whispered, "then end it now." Weber denied everything, and though Mayer believed him, the doubt lingered. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Meanwhile, Innsbruck was tightening its defenses. The Wehrmacht had begun fortifying positions in anticipation of the Allied advance. Mayer's intelligence, unit placements, fuel dumps, and troop counts became increasingly valuable. Wittenberg's reports helped coordinate precision bombing raids across the Brenner Line. Yet, the irony was cruel. The more successful they became, the more certain their exposure became too. Wittenberg's radio problems worsened as German jamming operations intensified. Static filled the receiver, bursts of coded Morse echoing across the spectrum. Then, one night, the connection was lost entirely. No acknowledgement from Bari. No confirmation tone. He tried again the next night, and the next. Nothing. For 3 days, silence. The mountains themselves seemed to absorb the signals. Cut off from OSS command, the team had no idea if their transmissions were reaching anyone or if they had already been compromised. Mayer wrote in his notebook, "We may be the last to know the war is over, or the first to die before it ends." It was not bravado, it was resignation. Innsbruck grew darker as the Reich's death throes shook the city. Refugees crowded the roads. Desertions increased. Wehrmacht units were collapsing into chaos. Amid this turmoil, Mayer continued gathering data, unaware that the Gestapo had already begun piecing together fragments of intercepted messages and local reports. They didn't yet have names, but they had locations. And they were closing in. The final days of April brought snow again to the higher passes, a cruel reminder that spring was still far away. Mayer and Wittenberg, exhausted and half-starved, met one last time in a mountain hut above Mutters. They spoke little, only agreeing that the mission would end soon, one way or another. Mayer would make one last trip into Innsbruck for confirmation of troop strength. Wittenberg would attempt to repair the broken line to Bari. If all went well, they would rendezvous again in 3 days. It was the last time they saw each other as free men. As Mayer descended into the city the next morning, he noticed increased checkpoints, Gestapo cars parked along the river, and unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Something had shifted. The hunter was now the hunted, and he could feel it in his bones. The missing courier, the radio silence, the rumors of betrayal, they all converged into one truth. Someone knew. April 27, 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. But for Friedrich Mayer, the OSS agent disguised as a German officer, the final chapter of Operation Greenup had just turned deadly. Innsbruck was trembling under the weight of its own collapse. Nazi banners still fluttered over the rooftops, but the city's defenders knew the end was near. The Gestapo, desperate and paranoid, had begun rounding up anyone suspected of disloyalty. In that chaos, Mayer made one last fateful trip to confirm troop positions near the city's rail yard, and walked straight into the trap that would nearly cost him his life. He had planned to meet a contact near the bridge on Annexstrasse, a resistance sympathizer who worked as a railway clerk. But someone had talked. As Mayer approached the rendezvous, 2 plainclothes Gestapo officers appeared from an alleyway. They called out, asking for his identification. Mayer hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for them to draw their pistols. Within minutes, he was surrounded, searched, and handcuffed. His forged documents and false uniform were confiscated. When they found his notebook filled with coded markings, there was no need for pretense. He was taken to the Gestapo headquarters on Herrengasse, a building that had become synonymous with screams. The interrogation began that same night. Mayer was stripped, beaten, and questioned for hours under blinding lights. The Gestapo officer in charge, Wilhelm Sieber, demanded to know his true identity and who he worked for. "I am a German officer returning from the front," Mayer repeated. When that failed, he switched to defiance. "You are losing the war. Nothing you do will change that." The blows that followed broke 2 of his ribs. His face became swollen, but his will remained unbroken. Somewhere in the building above him, the sound of Allied bombers echoed across the mountains. Innsbruck shook as the Brenner Pass was hit again. For Mayer, the thunder of explosions was both terror and hope, proof that his intelligence had reached its mark. "They were bombing what we told them to," he would later say. "That was all the comfort I needed." As dawn broke, Sieber brought in another interrogator, a weary Wehrmacht officer named Major Emil Fiegel. Unlike the Gestapo men, Fiegel was an old soldier, worn and pragmatic. He studied Mayer for a long time before speaking. "You're not a spy for money," he said. "You're here for something else." Mayer, exhausted and bleeding, gave him the truth he'd withheld from everyone else. He was an American OSS agent, Austrian by birth, Jewish by blood, and in this war to end the regime that had murdered his family. There was silence. Then, Fiegel did something unexpected. He ordered the guards out of the room. The conversation that followed would later become one of the most remarkable exchanges of the war. Mayer told Fiegel that Allied forces were only days away, that the U.S. 103rd Infantry Division had already crossed into Austria, and that Innsbruck would soon be surrounded. He urged Fiegel to surrender the city peacefully to avoid needless bloodshed. "You can fight for Hitler," Mayer said quietly, "or you can save your people." The major said nothing, but the seed had been planted. That evening, Mayer was thrown into a cell, half-conscious and covered in bruises. The guards expected him to be executed the next morning. But overnight, something changed. Fiegel returned, this time accompanied by the city's military commander, General Franz Hofer. The 2 men questioned Mayer privately, asking for proof of his claims. Mayer told them of Allied positions, troop movements, and the futility of resistance. He even offered to contact his commanders to coordinate a surrender. Incredibly, the German officers began to believe him. Mayer later recalled, "It was the strangest thing. They stopped treating me as an enemy and started treating me as the messenger of their own survival." On April 30th, word reached Innsbruck that Hitler was dead. Panic spread through the ranks. Wehrmacht soldiers threw down their weapons. SS men fled into the mountains. Fiegel, acting on Mayer's advice, opened a line of communication with approaching American forces. Within 48 hours, the 103rd Division, led by General Anthony McAuliffe, advanced into the city with minimal resistance. Innsbruck was liberated without a single shot fired in its streets. When the Americans entered the city, they found Mayer still in his cell, battered but alive. He had refused medical treatment until the surrender was completed. The liberating troops were astonished to learn that one of their own agents had been instrumental in securing the city's peaceful handover. A U.S. colonel who debriefed him wrote, "The courage and resourcefulness of Sergeant Mayer cannot be overstated. His conduct saved countless lives." But victory brought no closure. The Gestapo records concerning Mayer's capture were incomplete. The informant who betrayed his location was never identified. The missing courier, Alois, was never found. Some OSS files later hinted that German counterintelligence had been closing in on a wider spy network in Tyrol, one that Mayer's arrest may have inadvertently exposed. What truly happened in those final days remains shrouded in the fog of collapsing empire. As Mayer stood on a balcony overlooking Innsbruck after liberation, he could see smoke rising from the rail yard, the same one he'd once reported on. The city was quiet now, too quiet. He later said, "It was strange to win like that, to be free, but not to feel it." Though he was hailed as a hero, Mayer carried the weight of those he couldn't save. Wittenberg was still missing. Weber's fate was unknown. And somewhere in the valleys below, secrets were buried under the thawing snow, secrets that would haunt the OSS long after the war ended. When peace returned to Austria, it arrived in fragments, scattered reports, whispered rumors, and the uneasy silence of a country trying to forget. For Friedrich Mayer, survival was not triumph, it was the beginning of a haunting. The war was over, but the questions left behind by Operation Greenup would never rest as easily as the men who carried them. The Office of Strategic Services, soon to be dissolved and reborn as the CIA, began collecting its final reports from the European theater. Mayer, still recovering from his injuries, was summoned to a debriefing center in Verona, Italy, in May 1945. There, he sat before a panel of intelligence officers who wanted everything: dates, contacts, radio frequencies, codebooks. He gave them what he could, but when they asked for the complete transmission logs, he paused. "We don't have them," he admitted. The radio was destroyed in the retreat. What he didn't say was that some of their most vital notes, maps, cipher pads, and one half-burned notebook, had disappeared somewhere between Innsbruck and the mountains. When the OSS compiled its official report on Operation Greenup, it was incomplete. Radio transmission records from Wittenberg were missing, certain message acknowledgments from Bari could not be verified, and key coordinates for the team's infiltration route had been redacted. What should have been a clean victory file was riddled with gaps. One intelligence analyst scribbled a note in the margin: "Data inconsistency, possible deliberate omission." The mystery deepened when Franz Weber resurfaced briefly in June 1945. He was alive, hiding under an assumed name in Western Austria. Mayer arranged to meet him under U.S. supervision, but the encounter was tense. Weber insisted he had stayed loyal, that he had been forced into hiding when the Gestapo began arresting known defectors. Yet, his answers to certain questions, about his contacts, about who knew their drop zone, were evasive. Within weeks, Weber vanished again. His name disappeared from all subsequent OSS correspondence. Wittenberg, on the other hand, did return, thin, ill, but alive. He had managed to evade capture by fleeing deeper into the mountains after Mayer's arrest. For several weeks, he had hidden in barns and cellars until American troops reached Tyrol. When the two men were finally reunited, the relief was quiet, wordless. They didn't celebrate, they just sat in silence, knowing that so much of what they'd done would never be fully recorded. "You can't write the truth about missions like ours," Wittenberg said. "The truth itself becomes classified." In 1946, when the OSS was dissolved, its archives were scattered among various U.S. departments. The files on Operation Greenup were sealed, accessible only to senior intelligence officers. But the declassified portions that emerged decades later revealed disturbing inconsistencies: a destroyed supply cache listed as recovered in one report but never found on the ground. A courier's last known coordinates listed as approximate. An internal memo suggesting post-war protection of regional assets, a vague phrase that historians still debate. Some researchers now believe that Greenup was not merely an intelligence mission, but also a test, a field experiment in deep cover infiltration designed to inform future CIA operations in Soviet-controlled territories. If so, some of its outcomes were intentionally obscured to protect emerging Cold War strategies. Whether Mayer or Wittenberg ever knew this remains uncertain. The missing courier, Alois, became a ghost of the post-war years. Locals in Tyrol claimed he had been executed by retreating SS men. Others swore he had survived and fled to Switzerland with stolen gold. His body was never found, though in 1962 a rusted OSS-issued revolver was discovered near a collapsed mine shaft south of Oberperfuss. No one could confirm if it had belonged to him. For Mayer, the mystery gnawed at him for the rest of his life. "He was just a boy," he said in an interview decades later. "He believed in something he'd never lived to see." The classified OSS reports would remain sealed until the late 1980s, when fragments were finally released under the Freedom of Information Act. Even then, entire pages were blacked out. Researchers who examined the surviving documentation noticed a peculiar pattern: missing serial numbers, altered names, and references to secondary informants that could not be matched to any known individual. One historian remarked, "It reads less like a mission report and more like a cover-up." As the Cold War deepened, Operation Greenup quietly became part of the mythology of espionage, a story whispered among intelligence officers, a case study in how the line between truth and deception is often indistinguishable. The OSS veterans who knew Mayer respected him deeply but avoided pressing him about the missing records. "We all had missions that vanished into the fog," one former agent said. "That's how these things worked." And so, the mystery persisted, not out of malice, but perhaps necessity. Mayer himself chose to let the unanswered questions remain that way. "Some stories," he said, "don't want to be solved. They want to be remembered." Yet beneath that stoic acceptance was a sense of unease, the suspicion that the operation's legacy had been manipulated, rewritten for a new era of secrecy. What had truly happened to the lost courier? Who had betrayed their network? And why had key portions of their mission log been erased just as the OSS transitioned into the CIA? The official record ends with the phrase, "Mission completed successfully. No further action required." But for those who knew the men behind the mission, it was never that simple. The war might have ended, but the shadows it cast over Austria, and over their own memories, never truly lifted. Today, high in the Tyrolean Alps, the winds still sweep through the same valleys where Operation Greenup unfolded. The shepherds' huts have rotted away, and the trails where men once carried secret messages are now marked by hiking signs and ski paths. Yet, beneath the surface of that quiet beauty, the ghosts of a secret war remain, invisible but enduring. Decades after the mission, historians and intelligence officers began retracing the steps of Frederick Mayer and his team. What they found wasn't a story of simple heroism, but one woven with contradictions, courage entangled with secrecy, victory shadowed by loss. The drop zone near Aberperfuss was rediscovered in the late 1980s by a local historian, Dr. Gerhard Auer, who found fragments of a broken radio crystal and a rusted parachute buckle buried in the scree. "The mountains don't forget," Auer wrote. "They only wait for us to start listening again." Frederick Mayer returned to Innsbruck for the first time in 2008, at the age of 93. Standing before the Tyrolean Valley, he spoke softly to the reporters who had come to honor him. "It's strange," he said. "We risked everything to get in, and now anyone can just walk up the road." When asked about the missing records and the unsolved mysteries surrounding the mission, Mayer smiled faintly. "Maybe it's better that way," he said. "If everything were explained, people would stop wondering." For the intelligence community, Operation Greenup became a blueprint. The infiltration methods, false identities, and radio discipline developed by Mayer's team directly informed early CIA field doctrine. The agency even referenced Greenup in a classified 1951 training manual under the heading, "Small Unit Covert Penetration in Hostile Terrain." The lessons were clear. The smallest operations, guided by trust and precision, could reshape entire battlefronts. But the human cost was harder to quantify. Wittenberg, the radio operator who had once hidden in haylofts and barns, rarely spoke about the mission again. In an interview late in life, he said only, "I was a signal in the dark. That's all any of us were." Franz Weber was never found. Rumors persisted that he had been quietly recruited into Western intelligence during the early Cold War, his wartime betrayal forgiven or perhaps reinterpreted as pragmatism. None of it could be proven. The OSS documents, when finally declassified, left more questions than answers. Why were certain transmission records marked, classified indefinitely? Who ordered the destruction of the team's secondary cache? And why did U.S. intelligence keep contact with certain Tyrolean informants well into the 1950s? These were questions without closure, the kind of loose ends intelligence services prefer to leave untouched. Still, among local Austrians, Mayer and his men were remembered differently, not as spies, but as liberators. In 2013, a memorial plaque was placed near their original drop zone, dedicated simply, "To those who came through the snow for freedom." No names, no insignia, no politics, only gratitude. Standing before that plaque, one cannot help but feel the layers of history pressing against one another. The OSS Quiet War, fought in shadows and silence, helped save lives and hasten the end of tyranny. Yet it also birthed a new era, one where truth itself became a weapon, and where victory meant living with the unknown. Meyer's words, recorded in one of his final interviews, seemed to echo across time. We weren't heroes. We were just doing what had to be done. But we did it in the dark. Today, the valleys of Tyrol are peaceful. The tracks of German trains are long gone, replaced by tourist routes and mountain inns. The locals still tell stories of mysterious parachutes seen in the winter of 1945, of men who vanished into the snow and never returned. Perhaps some of it is myth, or perhaps memory itself is the last intelligence report that can never be redacted. Operation Greenup remains one of the most daring and least understood missions of the Second World War. Its success helped cripple a vital Nazi supply line and brought about the peaceful surrender of Innsbruck, yet its unanswered questions continue to ripple through history. Who betrayed them? What truths were buried in those missing files? And why, even after victory, did the silence persist? Maybe the answers are still out there, hidden beneath the snow of the Austrian Alps, or maybe, as Mayer once said, some stories are not meant to end. They're meant to remind us what secrecy costs. The mountains keep their secrets, and in their silence, the legacy of the men who fought and vanished behind enemy lines endures, eternal and unresolved.